access, food justice, or any webinar questions. Before we start tonight, I would like to thank our sponsors, Frontier Natural Products, UMass Risk Management, and Crop Insurance, for supporting the production of this series. I'd also like to thank New Entry Sustainable Farming Project and Tufts Friedman School of Nutritional Science and Policy for providing access to the WebEx software we're using to host tonight's workshop. Also, many thanks to all of the UMass staff who have helped to make this workshop possible, and that includes our board. If you are not a member of UMass, please consider becoming a member. Your membership helps us in our education and policy work. You can visit our website to learn more, or you can contact me. Tonight's presentation will be by Julie Fine, and she will be discussing tonight cover crop mixtures to grow our own nitrogen. The format for this webinar tonight will be a presentation with questions and answers to follow. And to ask a question, you can actually use the chat feature, which should be at your top right hand. Just type in your question, and I'll get that to our presenter. And just so that we can see that it's working and I can find out where our viewing audience is coming from, feel free to type in your name, your email, and where you're viewing tonight. Also, if you're joining us via phone, feel free to text me any of your questions at 413-214-1237. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on our guest tonight, Julie Fine. Julie, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so let's get you all.
All right. Can you see there?
Okay, and you should be able to show your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm excited to be talking about growing cover crop mixtures for nitrogen supply. This is sort of focused on the Northeast because that's where I live and work and do my research. I recently graduated from UMass with a master's in plant and soil science, and all of my research focused on cover crop mixtures. I was particularly interested in this because I love the idea of using living plants to recycle nutrients to increase diversity in soil biology. And I think it's really interesting what it's possible to do by combining multiple species to winter killed and winter hardy, things that are tall, things that climb, to get the most benefit out of cover crops. And I think, like a lot of us have found in having diverse species on our farms, the same is true for cover crops, right? We get more out of the complementarity of species. And given the crazy weather we've had in the Northeast this year, the capacity to adjust to changing environmental conditions is a really major benefit for cover crop mixtures. So I want to take a step back and look at the big picture. What we're doing here, right, is we're using plants basically to fix carbon from using those plant surfaces like big solar panels to draw carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and combine those to form carbohydrates. And that's the carbon that's going back into our soil, the carbon that's going into our food production, and then also using these symbiotic soil bacteria to either fix nitrogen or to sort of mediate nitrogen availability in the soil. And this is what we're really depending on when we're using cover crops for fertility for our cash crops. We're depending on that biological mediation. So we're using cover crops to contribute to feed the soil, to increase healthy soil. So it sort of covers all of the aspects of what healthy soil is, right? The chemical features of soil, the pH, which is critical, the capacity to exchange nutrients, whether those are macronutrients or micronutrients. We're using cover crops to feed the soil, from the really big stuff to the microscopic organisms, all of which are basically moving those nutrients through their bodies in order to make them accessible to plants and humans. And then we're also counting on cover crops for a lot of the really important physical characteristics of soil that we depend on as farmers, really having good soil aggregation, good texture, which matters both for soil conservation to prevent erosion, but also for texture when we're planting small seeded things, and we actually need to have a decent soil texture to get a good stand. And then for our subsequent plant growth in terms of preventing super dense or compact soils. So when we think about using cover crops to grow nitrogen, I'm going to start by saying we have these sort of basic soil goals. One of which is to have a moderate soil pH. And I don't think, when I started my research, I had really no idea how important soil pH was. It's like you can have the nutrients there, but if your soil is really acidic, your plants can't take it up. And I'm not going to get into why today, but it's really important to do regular soil pH testing, whether you do it yourself or do the inexpensive lab test. But most of our northeastern soils tend very quickly towards the acidic, and I can't tell you how many farms I've visited where their soils are at 5.5. They haven't thought about it in just a couple of years, but that's considered toxic for annual vegetable crops. So we got to start with decent soil pH, and then I put this as a goal. We're aiming for a decent amount of soil organic matter. It takes time to cultivate that, but it has a lot of benefits for our crop production and soil conservation. And then the other thing that I just sort of want to start out is I have this goal of seeing soil protected between October and March, whether that's something living, a living cover crop, or a mulch, or even plastic, anything that can help protect our soils from erosion from rain and snow. Boy, Anna just texted me that my presentation is not on the screen, and I can't understand why. Oh, I think I know why. I know why. Oh, that's such a bummer. Okay, can you guys see it now? I have no way of telling if you can all see it now. Okay, there we go. Oh, you missed all the good stuff at the beginning. Okay, so here's my pretty picture of cover crop mixtures. The big picture here, looking at soil health and the way everything is connected. And then here's where I was. So, legume cover crops, right? So this is the best way to grow nitrogen for our whatever food we're producing. So we have the obvious symbiotic nitrogen fixation that comes from legumes, whether those are peas or clovers. And the sustainability of this is, cannot be overemphasized in terms of growing it on your farm, not having to truck nitrogen in from somewhere else. You're not processing nitrogen that's a waste product from some other industry, and let alone the tremendous energy costs of synthetic nitrogen. So, the value of legume cover crops can't be underestimated. And then we also have this sort of interesting issue of phosphorus in the Northeast. So we have, some hidden dangers in compost and manure that I think that organic farmers actually know a lot more than conventional, because compost and composted manure tends to have a lot of phosphorus per the amount of nitrogen. And so if you look down here, if you look down where underneath organic fertilizer costs, composted chicken manure, has a significant amount of phosphorus for the nitrogen that you're receiving, and the demand of nitrogen among annual crops is really high, while the phosphorus demand is significantly lower. So every time you're putting down compost for your plants, you're putting down about 5 times more phosphorus than your plants really need to get sufficient nitrogen. And that's a real issue. So when we're looking at the cost of those fertilizers, not only is buying in fertilizer more expensive than growing a legume cover crop, but you're also potentially getting other nutrients that you don't really need. So my research in Western Mass here looked at using cover crops, particularly low residue winter-killed cover crops for no-till sweet corn production. And I was interested in those winter-killed cover crops just because I wanted a simplified production system where I wouldn't have to manage a ton of cover crop biomass in the spring when our soils are wet and cold and sort of hard to manage the timing of everything. Wanted to be able to get in for early sweet corn without having to plow in, 1 million tons per acre of, say, winter rye or something like that. So this is one of the graphs from my research, and it's the cost here is in hectares, but just sort of it's all comes out the same if we converted it to acres. Where you look at this kind of graph, so I have these cover crop mixtures. On the left is peas, oats, and forage radish. OFR is oats and forage radish. FR is just forage radish alone, and that's compared to no cover crop, which is essentially a bunch of weeds. So you look at this and you think, boy, planting cover crops, that's really expensive. The more diverse cover crop I plant, the more money I'm paying. That's $245 an acre, or a hectare. That's a lot. But then, I also evaluated the yield on those sweet corn plots. And when you look at the benefit of those cover crops, it turns out they really pay off. So here I'm just showing you part of the data because I could talk for hours. But you get about 70,000 ears of sweet corn more from the oat and forage radish plot than you do from the no cover crop plot. And I think that's for multiple reasons. Some of that has to do with nitrogen, some of it has to do with soil cover. But when you look at the bottom line, the costs of seeding the cover crop, the cost of the seed itself, is not that great compared to the benefit that you get. So it can be really cost effective depending on how you plan it. So it's important to sort of maximize the benefits of your cover crop by really considering all the factors. So one of the biggest ones is what season you're going to grow it in. It entirely depends on what your cash crops are, what your markets are, and when you have time and space. So for some people, that's a spring cover crop. For other people, it's sort of after their main season cash crops. So that's something that every person has to really decide for themselves. And then what equipment you have for planting will affect the type of cover crop. So, it's hard to just throw peas out into a field that hasn't been tilled, hasn't been really prepared well, and to not incorporate them in some way. They just won't germinate well. You're putting a lot of money out there in the form of pea cover crop seed, and maybe not getting the most bang for your buck there. So you want to think about how you're going to plant it to really take advantage of what you're putting into it. And then also it's important to consider your initial fertility. The sort of standing nitrogen status of your soil is really important. If it's really low, for many different reasons it could be low, then it's a much better use of a legume cover crop. If you have low soil organic matter, that's another good reason to use you have low soil organic matter, it's a good reason to use a high legume percentage in your cover crop. If you have a lot of nitrogen left over from something, if you've grown a lot of sweet corn, if you put down a lot of fertilizer for one thing or another, or you have a really high organic matter soil for some reason, it's good to plant more grasses to soak that up. And there's other considerations like boron and sulfur. Like, you need to have those nutrients in the soil in order to be able to cycle and recycle them with a cover crop. So you have to really evaluate your initial soil status before you decide what mixture you're going to plant. Weed control is always an issue. And in our case, growing legume cover crops weeds are really a problem because they can often outcompete legumes during the establishment phase of a cover crop. So that's another good reason to plant a mixture, because if you're planting some legumes and some grasses, then you get more weed control, and that will help your legumes establish and grow more nitrogen. And then the next thing that you need to think about is how you're going to terminate or incorporate your cover crop. People who are growing winter rye often have some really serious management issues in the spring, figuring out what to do with their massive amounts of rye. If, like, say it's been a wet spring and they weren't able to plow it down quite as soon as they wanted, you know, you can get 5 feet tall winter rye, and that's just really hard to manage. So you want to sort of think, like, what equipment do I have, and do I want to use it at this time of year? Or would I rather just grow like a quick early spring, early summer cover crop and incorporate it later? So that's up to you. And then I think earlier I sort of mentioned soil health goals, so I won't go over that too much, but considering what cover crop mixture you want to plant is definitely dependent on what you're aiming for. If you're trying to increase soil organic matter, if you're just doing it for the nitrogen for your cover crops, or if you are planting cover crops for some other reason, or if you have some other major soil health goal, like increasing biological activity. And then later we'll talk more about this sort of biomass versus nitrogen percentage issue. But with cover crops, we're always sort of thinking, like, am I going to grow something that has a high percentage of nitrogen or a lot of biomass, or am I trying to sort of balance those things out in some more even way? But when you think about, when you think about, like, if you're growing a really high nitrogen cover crop and you have a small biomass, it might actually turn out to be the same amount of total nitrogen as something that has sort of a moderate amount of nitrogen concentration and a moderate amount of biomass. So you can actually grow like a high nitrogen cover crop and not have that much biomass to deal with if it's something that fixes a lot of nitrogen or scavenges a lot of nitrogen. So I'll try and get more into some of the how to implement it here. I would say the most popular 2 species mixture in the Northeast is probably winter rye and hairy vetch. Vetch is an excellent nitrogen fixer, but it has these challenges of being sort of low biomass and lying flat on the ground and having a sort of a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means it decomposes quickly, and sometimes that nitrogen, if you just plant vetch, goes away pretty quickly and isn't in the soil when your cash crop needs it. And rye is sort of the opposite qualities. It doesn't fix nitrogen, although it's an excellent scavenger of it. It has a ton of biomass. It grows pretty fast in the fall, so you can plant it really late, which is often good for our production systems. And it has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, sometimes too high. So there's been a lot of research done about combining these 2 species and what proportion is appropriate. And it's really interesting to dig into the literature, but basically, winter rye is such a major competitor with other species that you really want to, especially with a weaker legume like hairy vetch, you want the proportion by seed weight to be something between 50 to 90% vetch. If you're growing it for nitrogen, that will be available for your following season's crop. So I think that's kind of an important take home and not entirely intuitive. Because that can mean something like, you know, only 20 pounds of rye per acre. And don't forget the inoculant for your vetch. That's important too. So I'm going to talk about some of the, so that's the most popular mixture in the Northeast. I'm going to talk about some of the winter-killed mixtures that I tried, just because I think they're sort of good examples of what we're trying to do in terms of growing nitrogen for crops. So in my research, I had mentioned earlier, forage radish, oat forage radish, and at the bottom of the screen, you can see the seeding rates, pea oat forage radish, and no cover crop, which in our case turned out to be just a tremendous amount of lamb's quarters. And so here's the data that I decided to present to you all that I think is really interesting. So the left-hand graph that's in green is the cover crop biomass. So this was done in 2 different years. So you can kind of either look at both years or average them in your brain. But the pea, oat, and forage radish had some of the higher biomass dry matter production, although pretty similar to the oat and forage radish combo. But then if you look at the right hand of the screen, you have the nitrogen accumulation in that same biomass. So you can see that the forage radish is much higher in concentration, much higher in its nitrogen concentration. So they all come out kind of the same in terms of how much nitrogen they're accumulating in their biomass. But the forage radish, it winter kills, and by spring there's hardly any residue left on the ground. You can just sort of see a thin netting of radish leaves over the soil surface. So it accumulates a lot of nitrogen, but it decomposes really quickly. And what we found, and the same is true with the weeds actually, they can accumulate a significant amount of nitrogen in their dry matter, but they release it really quickly. And so what we found, I showed a little bit of the sort of cost analysis earlier, is we find that even though those numbers aren't that different in terms of how much nitrogen is accumulated in the biomass of these cover crops, the way that that nitrogen is released is a totally different dynamic. And I'll show you a little more of that data in a few slides. So, you know, I'm referring here back to the idea of how much cover crop biomass are you growing and what is it doing for you in terms of accumulating nitrogen. There's been a tremendous amount of research on cover crop biomass and what kind of ecosystem services does cover crop biomass provide. So just the biomass alone, set aside the nutrients that are contained within it. But generally that biomass is correlated with nitrate leaching prevention. That says, generally speaking, more biomass is associated with more nitrogen accumulation. And then more biomass is certainly associated with more carbon and therefore more contributions to soil organic matter in the long run. However, when you grow a really high biomass cover crop, even if it has a lot of nitrogen in it, generally speaking, that nitrogen is not available to the subsequent crop. And that's because that nitrogen is basically all really busy being bound up to decompose the high amounts of biomass, the large amounts of carbon that are contained within it. And that subsequently reduces the cash crop yield. And then there's not to mention dealing with the biomass, meaning incorporating it or mowing it or tilling it in some way. So there's always sort of this balance between, do I want a lot of cover crop biomass or do I want the right kind of cover crop biomass? And our UMass Extension did a really interesting research project in the last couple of years called Growing Our Own Nitrogen. So it was 6 on-farm trials, and they looked at having farmers grow leguminous cover crops to figure out if those could be sufficient to supply nitrogen for the following cash crop, either just the cover crop treatment alone or the cover crop with a little bit of supplemental nitrogen fertilizer. And then this research project really focused on using the pre-side dress soil nitrate test as a tool for looking at nitrogen sufficiency. And so that's just a really simple test of looking at soil nitrate in the top 6 inches of your soil. And it's sort of like a quick test. It costs $8 to run, send it to your lab, and you can make fairly quick turnaround decisions about whether or not your crop needs additional fertilizer. So the cover crops that were evaluated were no cover crop, the common mixture of winter rye and hairy vetch. And I think you'll notice that that proportion of 70 pounds of rye and 20 pounds of vetch doesn't do a ton of nitrogen fixation because it's nowhere near that 50-50 split that's now recommended by scientific research. And then the third cover crop was farmer's choice. So I'm going to show you these farmer's choices because I think they're really interesting. Don't write these down. They're Some of them were really wild choices. They didn't work that well, but they were given total freedom to decide what they wanted to plant. So you can see there are the 6 farms, and it ranges in everything from totally winter-killed crops to sort of higher biomass producing crops. And I mean, among the interesting things are, if you look at the range in prices, like you have $485 an acre for a sort of a double cover cropping treatment. You have an oat pea vetch that's $300 an acre, all the way down to a more modest $52 an acre. And it's interesting because there was really no correlation between how much money you spent on your cover crop choice and what you got out of it. So that's an excellent thing to have learned from this project. The other thing I want to sort of point out here is look at the range of percent soil organic matter on these farms. It's like quite the span, you know, from good old UMass with 1.7% organic matter, tilled the heck out of that soil, all the way up to 6.8, where there's been a lot of manure applied over years. And then if you look at those fall nitrate parts per million, you can just see that like some of those farms do not have any nitrogen there to scavenge in the fall. That's just, those are good opportunities to plant a lot of legumes and do a lot of fixation. If you only have 5, 25, 30 parts per million of nitrate, it's time to plant some legumes. But if you're looking at 105 parts per million of nitrate, then it's more about sort of scavenging what you have and recycling that for the next year. I also want to point out here, if you look at the Twin Oaks Farmer's Choice selection, it has a mixture of 3 rye, crimson clover, and tillage radish. And that was a really good lesson in don't plant too much tillage radish. That 10 pounds just completely overwhelmed the rye and crimson clover. It should probably have been like 2 pounds of radish in that mixture. So I just don't want you to get any ideas from that high rate of radish. So these are the results from those farms. The red bars are no cover crop. That's just weeds recycling nitrogen. The green is the rye vetch mixture, and the farmer's choice, which of course is really different from farm to farm. But you can see that, you know, kind of wildly different amounts of nitrogen in that above ground cover crop biomass. And that the one on your right that says many, that's actually the most expensive cover crop treatment. And the one that says twin is the least expensive cover crop treatment. So you can see that it's really complicated. It's about how much nitrogen is in the soil to start with that you're recycling, what you've picked to recycle, what species you've selected to use for your nitrogen cycling or fixing. And I'll show you some more data from this research project. But I think the take home here is just that there are some simple cover crop mixtures that are affordable and will get you where you want to be. And also that rye and vetch is like a pretty decent standard to hold by. So I want to mention some research by my colleague and friend Sam Glaze-Corcoran at UMass. She's looking at a lot of different things, but one of her projects is SUNN hemp. And she's really excited about this because it is just a tremendous biomass producer and nitrogen fixer. She's using a 30 pound per acre seeding rate using a grain drill. You'd have to use more if you're just broadcasting that seed. But this is a tropical legume that you can really only grow in the hottest part of the year here. But if you look on the right-hand side there, in mid-July, if you let that grow for 30 days, that's going to fix 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's so much nitrogen. And it also is pretty woody and stemmy. So Sam's been experimenting with using SUNN hemp as like a nitrogenous mulch for garlic and thinking about ways that you could actually cut it or chop it or compost it or turn it into silage or something to capture that nitrogen and then use it as fertilizer for the next year. not necessarily by using it as like a green manure that you're incorporating directly into the soil immediately, but as something that you're sort of saving, and you could bale it or even compost it and potentially recycle that 250 pounds an acre of free nitrogen. And the seed is not it's not terribly expensive. It's not cheap, but you can do it. Okay, so what I've tried to do so far is to talk about nitrogen acquisition, right? Nitrogen scavenging and cover crops acquiring or fixing nitrogen. They're holding it in their tissue. And then the next challenge for us as growers is how to get that nitrogen released when our crops need it. So generally speaking, grasses are good at retaining nitrogen, at scavenging it from the soil and holding it within their tissues, and they're not so good at giving it back. So winter rye, the sort of best example, and it's true for high carbon grasses. The nitrogen that they contain in their tissue generally ends up being used by decomposers to decompose the carbon. And so it's not ever available to your plants. It's just being sort of cycled very tightly within that cover crop biomass. On the other hand, legumes are good at fixing nitrogen, supplying additional nitrogen, but they're not good at retaining it. They just decompose super quickly. They don't have a lot of carbon in there, and so that nitrogen just gets quickly taken up by those microbes and released. And so that can be a real challenge because you can lose all that nitrogen that you've worked so hard and spent money on to fix, to retain, and you're not getting it when you need it, or it's not being recycled back to you at the appropriate time. So we're trying to sort of maximize this trade-off here between these by creating good mixes. And some principles to do that are, in the fall, you would like to have low soil nitrate. So that's sort of hoping that your cash crop has used up all of the nitrogen that's sort of left in the soil. You also want to reduce tillage in the fall so you're not releasing additional nitrogen by introducing more oxygen. And you also sort of want to avoid applying manure in the fall, although manure is a complicated issue now, and I don't even want to get into that tonight. But that having low soil nitrogen in the fall, if you're doing a fall planted legume-based cover crop mixture, is really important. If you have a lot of nitrogen, those lazy legumes are just not going to fix it from the atmosphere. They're just going to sort of hang out and let the grasses do all the work, soaking up the existing nitrate. So in general, to balance retention and supply, you want to reduce grass species to be about 20% of their suggested monoculture rate. So if you go to your favorite cover cropping book and you look up what the monoculture rate is, you want to make sure you're looking it up for either drill, seeding, or broadcasting. But you want to sort of make sure that your grass species are 20% of that if you're aiming to balance that retention and supply. And then the other thing that I think is sort of important, and I'll talk a little more about, is that one really good way to do this is to not rely on your cover crop for nitrogen 100%. What we've seen in a lot of published literature is that if you count on your cover crop for, say, 50 to 75% of the nitrogen that your cash crop is going to need, and then you supplement with nitrogen fertilizer at the peak of crop demand, that's when you really get the most bang for your buck. You're able to get your cash crop all of the nitrogen it needs and when it needs it, and sort of take advantage of the cover crop without depending on it so much that you are not supplying nitrogen sufficiently at the right time. So it's really all about releasing nitrogen when we want it. So the ideal microbial diet has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of around 24:1. And that's all about us. That's the carbon-nitrogen ratio that we want for those microorganisms to release nitrogen at our rate for in-season availability. And, winter rye can have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 90:1. That's not unusual at all if it's sort of on the mature side of things. And a really green legume like a hairy vetch cover crop can be 10:1. So that's one of the great things about mixtures, is that you're able to sort of balance that carbon to nitrogen ratio and make it so that those decomposers are able to use the nitrogen that's there to break down the carbohydrates and do that in sort of at a rapid rate so that it's available in season. And the timing of that is usually around 4 to 6 weeks after the cover crop has been terminated, whether the cover crop has been usually incorporated, because that's the most efficient way to have nitrogen released or nitrogen maintained. I should clarify that, I mean, you don't get the most nitrogen if you're just like mowing a cover crop and leaving it on the surface. You want to incorporate it at least a little bit, get soil contact, and that conserves nitrogen, prevents it from evaporating back into the atmosphere. So the timing of nitrogen mineralization from all of this good organic matter, it tends to happen around 4 to 6 weeks after incorporation. And then when you look at the dashed line there, which indicates crop demand, the peak crop demand is usually 6 to 8 weeks after transplant. It depends a lot on the crop, and there's some good graphs that can tell you exactly when the peak demand is for each vegetable crop. But you can see that those peaks, they do not overline. They do not overline. They do not align. They do not overlap. And so right there is sort of the crux of our problem. And cover crop mixtures can help those peaks align a little bit better. But when I just referred to using a little bit of supplemental fertilizer, that's sort of where you hit the sweet spot, because you're able to apply that, say, at 6 weeks, and it just extends the amount of available nitrogen for your crop to where it fully needs it. So this is data from the UMass trial on the 6 farm on-farm trial with the farmer's choice, the vetch and rye, and the no cover crop. So, oops, I forgot the legend here, but the red is no cover crop, the green is vetch and rye, and the blue is the farmer's choice. So this is just one example of the timing of nitrogen availability for the crop. So the x-axis there is the weeks after cover crop incorporation, 2, 4, 6, 8. This is growing cabbage in Hadley, Mass. And you can see the range of nitrate in the soil, and that sufficiency range. Oh, the other thing I didn't mention is all of these cover crop treatments were split again, so that some of them received a small amount of supplemental nitrogen. I think it was 40 pounds an acre, but it's something close to that, of supplemental nitrogen, and that's about 2 weeks after cover crop incorporation. So the dashed lines did not receive any supplemental nitrogen fertilizer, and the solid lines did. So you can see that despite that cover crop, that was a fairly light cover crop of forage radish, just a little bit of crimson clover and Faria annual rye. So a couple of those get close to the sufficiency range, but it's only the supplemental nitrogen fertilizer treatments that get close to the sufficiency range. The other ones all stay pretty low. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about this is that all of these treatments, all of those cover crop receiving plots grew cabbage, and the cabbage yield was perfectly reasonable for all of those. So even the ones that didn't receive supplemental fertilizer, the yield was really good. The yield was great in those treatments that approached the sufficiency range, or really excellent yield. So it just shows the power of a little supplemental fertilizer at the right time for those crops. And it also goes to show, I think, that you can do a lot with not a ton of nitrate hanging around in the soil. A lot of nitrogen is lost just in our summer rains. So if you can sort of maintain a fairly low baseline and just get into that sufficiency range and not above it, you save a lot of nitrogen from going into our water. Oh, a lot of information about plant available nitrogen. So if you're interested in learning more about this idea of plant available nitrogen, go to this website. It's the Oregon State Small Farm website. And if you just type in Oregon State plant available nitrogen, you'll pull up this really wonderful 20-page resource. It's a PDF that talks about, growing cover crops to supply nitrogen for your cash crops, and it teaches you a lot of ways to assess that at home. And so some of it you can do rule of thumb just by figuring out how much cover crop you've grown and sort of generally how nitrogenous it is. And then they also teach you ways to send it off to a lab and then actually calculate how much nitrogen you've grown in your cover crop. But just to give you a couple of the major take-homes from this great resource, that legume cover crops themselves can provide, on average, 100 pounds of plant available nitrogen per acre. So plant available nitrogen refers to the combination of nitrate and ammonia. And often in extension, we just look at the nitrate, but plant available nitrate tries to take multiple forms of nitrogen into account to get a better assessment of it. And so this is, you want to maximize the amount of nitrogen that your legumes are fixing by letting them grow all the way until they start to flower, till they have flower buds. In contrast, cereal cover crops can immobilize 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's why we're growing mixes here. And they say that when you have 75% of a cover crop being cereal and 25% being legume, you really still don't end up providing any plant available nitrogen to your subsequent crop. You really have to get a higher percentage, 50% legumes, 50% cereals, or more legumes than that to really actively supply nitrogen to your following cash crop. You can send a little sample of your cover crop to a lab, and they can tell you how much nitrogen is in the dry matter, and you can use that to calculate how much nitrogen you might have recycling to your crop. It's not very expensive to do. And this is sort of repetitive. If you have something that's more nitrogenous, it's going to provide more nitrogen to your plants. And then just re-emphasizing here that most of that plant available nitrogen from cover crop biomass is not available until 4 to 6 weeks after cover crop termination. And often we're transplanting stuff into the soil. We're transplanting veggies into the soil, a week or two after cover crop termination and incorporation. So we have to think about when that nitrogen is going to be available to the plants. This is on the same theme here, timing of soil nitrogen availability. This is from my research in no-till sweet corn, and it's just to sort of emphasize, don't worry about all the colors, but you can see that where the green arrow is, that's when the corn is planted in mid-May. There's no tillage or incorporation in this system, but if you look at just how the cover crop biomass is decomposing and making nitrogen available in the soil, you can see that in a forage radish treatment on the left, there's a lot of nitrogen available in the soil in mid-May, right after the corn is planted, not when the corn needs it. The corn doesn't need a lot of nitrogen until closer to early and mid-June. And by then, and after forage radish cover crop, by then your nitrate is already decreasing. But if you look at the graph in the top right, you can see that in mid-May when the corn is planted, there's a lower amount of soil nitrate. And the peak availability of soil nitrate coincides with the peak demand of the sweet corn. And so that's why we use cover crop mixtures, because you basically can change the timing of the availability of your soil nitrate. And I'll show you the proportions of that oat and forage radish mixture in this slide. Let's see. So these are some of our common Northeast mixtures that some of them are just from farmers that I work with, and some of them are from research. So winter rye and hairy vetch, looking at planting that at 50 pounds per acre for each of those species. And I tend to focus on winter cover crops just because that's something I like, and usually most people are growing vegetables during the spring and summer and don't have a lot of space for cover crop. But that's also, a wonderful option if you have the land for it. I'm going to talk about Freya annual rye for a second. That's a cover crop that is being explored really actively by farmers as an alternative to winter cereal rye. And it grows more like a forage. I mean, it was developed as a forage grass, so it looks more like green pasture. It doesn't develop really woody stems. It has a really great root system, and a lot of growers have been telling me that they get this like chocolate cake effect after they grow Freya annual rye, especially in combination with crimson clover, that they just get this beautiful tilth, and it's super easy to incorporate. So that's something that that's like a really interesting sort of up and coming mixture component. So I'll let you look at those. I'm not going to sort of talk through each one of them, but if this slide is something you're interested in, my email will be at the end of the presentation, and you can just shoot me an email and I can send this to you. So I work for Johnny's Selected Seeds. We sell some commercially available mixtures, one that's been developed and used at our research farm in Maine. The fall green manure mix has rye, field peas, ryegrass, crimson clover, and hairy vetch in it. And we also have a spring green manure mix, which is just a little, adds hairy vetch to a really common pea and oat mixture. And I should say that the Johnny's website has a lot of resources on, we classify it as farm seed, but if you want to just look at our resources on cover crop choices, our website is a good place to do that. So I never quite have enough time. I'm going to have to talk really quickly about how you can make your own cover crop mixture. If you've figured out what services you want from your cover crop, and you've figured out how you want to plant it and sort of what time slot you have available in your production system, it's great to select species that have some kind of complementary growth, that like vetch and rye idea. Something that's tall, something that's short. Sometimes it's nice to combine a cover crop that winter kills with a crop that will regrow in the early spring. And different nutrient acquisition strategies, some scavengers and some nitrogen fixers. You want to sort of look at if your selected species have any major drawbacks, like if you have a major weed problem in a particular field and you have a lot of legumes in the mix, maybe you want to add some grasses to mitigate that. And then the next slide will help determine an appropriate seeding rate. And these are also slides where if you want to have these rules in a file somewhere, just send me an email. I can send them to you. So rules for seeding rates. Winter hardy grasses like rye should, excuse me, be reduced to a quarter or a half of their monoculture rate. I think elsewhere I said 20%, and that depends a lot on how many species you're putting into your mixture. If you only have a winter hardy grass and one legume, then you can include a little bit more grass. But if you're trying to use like 3 different legumes and 1 grass, then you really want to reduce a winter hardy grass down to 20% of its monoculture rate. So let's see. If you have functionally redundant species, like say you're using annual ryegrass and triticale, you want to divide your seeding rate by the number of redundant species. So the idea is that you just don't want too many grasses in there, basically. Legumes in general are just planted at or near their monoculture rates. If you have a lot of different legumes, you don't want to do that. It gets really expensive. But basically, legumes are not great competitors, and sometimes they're hard to establish if you don't have a seed drill. So you want to plant them. You want to select a pretty high seeding rate for successful establishment. No matter what seeding rate you determine, it should be at least 30 pounds an acre. If it's not that, then add some more legumes in there, because 30 pounds an acre is sort of the minimum to get a good stand. And then if you're using a tillage radish or a forage radish or a field daikon, you want to really make sure you don't include too much of that. Probably 2 to 4 pounds in a mixture is more than enough. And then if you're broadcast seeding, you should look up specific rates for broadcast seeding. One rule of thumb is to increase your totals over a drilled seeding rate by 40%. And this graph here is just repeating the theme of how cereal rye is very dominant. I'm going to skip that because it's not helpful. I've sort of said it already. How many species is too many? So there's been a lot of research in the last couple of years about multi-species cover crops, and basically you don't get a ton of additional benefit from a ton of species. So these people who are making like 12 species cocktails, there are certainly reasons to do that, but generally speaking, 4 cover crop species is generally pretty good and diverse, and gives you what you need without being too expensive. I think I've talked about all of these things already. So this is my sort of Michael Pollan, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, spiel. Manage your soil pH. If you want to cycle nutrients, make sure they're there to begin with. Reduce your tillage kind of any way you can, because that helps in every regard. And don't plant too much winter rye. So I want to thank folks at UMass Extension who I worked with on all of my research, and Sam and Kirsten who supplied me with some of their graduate research. Northeast SARE provided a grant that funded my graduate research. And then here's a little list of resources. These are some of my favorite books and websites. And you'll see my email at the bottom of the screen. Oh, if there are people who called in, I'll just say it's jfine@johnnyseeds.com, and fine is F-I-N-E. And if you want copies of any of the slides that I presented tonight, or want to ask cover crop questions or questions about vegetable varieties, that's where to find me, and I'm always happy to be a resource. So let's see. I wonder if I can figure out how to take questions.
All right. Well, I tell you, that was a very informative presentation, very in-depth, and I could see the development of your research, so I truly am grateful and thankful for your time. And there are a few questions that came in, if you don't mind taking a few questions.
Sure.
Okay. So one viewer actually had a question and this actually came from the end of your presentation, towards the end. You had mentioned monoculture rates, and she wanted to know if you could define what that means. What does a monoculture rate mean?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So by that, I just mean if you look up in, the Northeast cover crop handbook, if you looked up hairy vetch, it would give you a rate for planting hairy vetch as a cover crop. So that, say 100 pounds an acre. So we call that the monoculture rate, if you're just planting a lone stand of hairy vetch.
Okay. There was a question that came in concerning legumes. You had mentioned legumes. Are there particular legumes that are better at supplying nitrogen than others? And are there some that you recommend?
Yeah, there are definitely some. Let me see if I can go back and, whoops. So hairy vetch is sort of the gold standard for nitrogen fixation. It just does a really good job, and it grows both a high concentration of nitrogen through its fixation, but it also grows more biomass than some of the other legumes. So in the end, you get more pounds per acre of nitrogen. Crimson clover is kind of the next best favorite, I would say. On top of being a spectacularly beautiful plant, it fixes a lot of nitrogen, and it has a really interesting root structure that tends to improve soil over time. I really like field peas, but that's in part because I like winter-killed cover crops just for management ease. And I think those are sort of the top three in the Northeast. You know, our challenge if you're growing winter legumes is that the only really hardy ones are hairy vetch and crimson clover is winter hardy in most years. But we don't have a lot of options for other legumes to grow over winter. In summer, you have more clovers you can choose from, and you can grow peas, and sun hemp is the best summer nitrogen fixer.
Okay. Another viewer asked a question in terms of timing, and you mentioned the fall and winter cover crops. Is there a downside to growing cover crops within a cash crop, say like tomatoes or eggplant or something like that?
Yeah, well, yes and no. It totally depends on the timing and the spacing. So a lot of people are having success planting a low-growing cover crop like in the pathways in between beds of tomatoes or eggplant, something like a Ladino clover or a New Zealand white clover, something that sort of stays low and doesn't get up competing with the cash crop, or a mixture of like Freya rye and a clover. So those are some good choices. There's been a lot of people have really tried to sort of interplant a cover crop right up to the, into the root zone of tomatoes and eggplants and corn, and it just ends up competing with the vegetable crop. So you want to make sure that you have enough space for the vegetable crop to have its own root zone and the cover crop to have its own root zone, and sort of give it space that way.
Okay, very good. And then our last question is in reference to getting some of your cover crop sampled or tested. Is there a particular lab that you can recommend where people, if they wanted to, could send a sampling of their cover crops?
Yeah, well, UMass has a soil and plant tissue testing laboratory that can do it, so that's a really easy one. You can also, if you live in Western Mass, you can drop it off there, but you can mail them in and they'll do the analysis. People who live in dairy-producing country, a lot of the milk companies like Dairy One do that kind of testing because they'll do tissue testing for pasture and hay. So that's another option. And I know that I think that UVM and University of Maine also have and University of Connecticut actually, all of those folks that have a good extension program going have their own tissue testing. Actually, I don't know about UVM, but I know Maine and Connecticut do.
All right. Well, if you don't mind putting your contact information back up so people can take it down, for those of you who are on the phone, you can feel free to reach out to me at anna@nofamass.org for Julie's contact information as well. Julie, again, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. This was a wonderful presentation. It's great to see the end result of your research and the great use it's going to be for farmers, whether you're small, large, community gardeners. All this information is very useful, so we're very grateful to you for that. And will you be presenting at the upcoming winter conference at Worcester State?
Oh, I don't think I am presenting.
Okay. Because I was going to put in a little plug for you.
But I will be presenting at the summer conference, but I think I forgot to register for the winter conference.
Okay. Well, at any rate, if Julie, if you are presenting at the summer conference, I have seen her present. It is a workshop you definitely don't want to miss. So stay tuned for that information on the summer conference. But our bigger conference is coming up in the very near future. January 12th at Worcester State is the summer conference, Food as Medicine. And what Julie talked about tonight was food as medicine, where our soil is concerned. So please go to our No for Mass conference website to get registered. I think the early bird is still in progress. If you need any help, feel free to give me a call or to email me. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking their time out right after the holiday. We really appreciate your support. I want to thank Julie for taking time out of her busy schedule for presenting to us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Now, as a reminder, our webinar next month will be earlier in December. It'll be December 18th. We'll hear from Anthony Mecca of the Biodynamic Association talking about farming using the biodynamic method. And so look for that information to come soon. If you'd like a reminder to be on the list for that, please feel free to email me. Again, thank you all. This presentation will be up in our archives by the end of the week. And you all have a great and wonderful night. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.